There's a book that has been read by generals, CEOs, football coaches, and self-help gurus for centuries. A book so widely quoted that its phrases have become background noise, printed on motivational posters, referenced in boardroom presentations, dropped into conversations by people who have never opened the original text. And almost everyone who quotes it misunderstands it completely. The Art of War is not a book about combat. It's not a manual for aggression, dominance, or crushing your rivals. When you read it carefully, when you strip away the mythology and sit with the actual logic, you discover something that the battlefield metaphors have been hiding for 2,000 years. Sun Tzu was an economist, not in title, not by training, but in obsession. Because the question that drives every page of The Art of War is not how do you win, it is what does winning cost? And in a world where kingdoms were spending themselves into oblivion chasing military glory, that question was not philosophical, it was existential. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and the most dangerous weapon ever forged turns out to be compound interest. To understand what Sun Tzu was actually solving, you need to stand inside his world for a moment, because his ideas were not born in calm reflection. They were forged under extreme economic pressure. China, in the late spring and autumn period, moving into the Warring States era, roughly the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, was not experiencing war as an occasional disruption. War was the operating condition. Dozens of competing kingdoms, each ruling fragments of a fractured empire, each convinced that total dominance was one campaign away. The scale of what these kingdoms attempted was staggering. Earlier Chinese warfare had been a relatively contained affair, aristocratic in character, almost ceremonial, fought between small elite forces with chariots and formal rules of engagement. Honor mattered. Outcomes were negotiated. Costs were manageable. But by Sun Tzu's era, that world had collapsed. Armies were no longer hundreds of warriors on chariots. They were tens of thousands of conscripted infantry, farmers, craftsmen, laborers pulled from the fields and handed weapons. Feeding them required grain stores. Moving them required wagons, horses, and roads. Equipping them required iron, leather, wood, and the skilled workers to shape those materials into usable weapons. Sustaining them in the field for weeks or months required a supply chain of staggering complexity, and someone had to pay for all of it. This is the economic reality that Sun Tzu was navigating. Every time a king mobilized his army, he was not just making a military decision, he was making a financial commitment with catastrophic downside risk and no guaranteed return. A campaign that succeeded quickly might pay for itself through captured resources and tribute. A campaign that dragged on for seasons, or worse, ended in defeat, could unravel the entire fiscal structure of the state. Kings who didn't understand this buried their kingdoms. Sun Tzu intended to prevent that.
His opening line is the most important sentence in the entire book, and almost nobody treats it as the warning it actually is. War is of vital importance to the state. Not glorious, not honorable, not the proving ground of nations. Vital, as in capable of sustaining or destroying life. Sun Tzu chose that word deliberately. He is telling rulers from the very first sentence that war is a life or death matter, not because of the soldiers who die in battle, but because of the financial consequences that follow. He then identifies 5 factors that determine the outcome of any conflict. Most readers treat these as philosophical categories: moral law, climate, terrain, leadership, method. But read them as a CFO would, and something different emerges. Moral law. Can your population absorb the costs you are about to impose on them without fracturing? Are they committed enough to your cause to accept higher taxes, reduced labor, and the loss of sons and brothers without rebellion? Heaven and earth. Timing and terrain. Are you fighting at a moment and in a location that minimizes your costs and maximizes your enemies? Are you spending your resources efficiently or bleeding them into ground that offers no advantage? The commander. Is your general someone who understands resource management, who knows when to advance, when to hold, and most critically, when the cost of pushing forward exceeds the value of what lies ahead? Method and discipline. Is your supply chain running efficiently? Are your administrators honest? Is your army moving with the kind of organizational precision that prevents the enormous waste that plagued every undisciplined military force in history? Sun Tzu is not describing the poetry of war. He is describing a risk assessment framework. He is asking rulers to calculate before they commit, something almost none of them did. The section of The Art of War that reveals Sun Tzu's financial genius most directly is one that receives almost no attention in popular culture: his treatment of logistics. He devotes substantial space to a calculation that on its surface seems mundane. When an army marches far from home, the cost of transporting a single unit of grain grows exponentially with distance. By the time supplies travel a significant distance, you have consumed enormous resources simply in the act of delivering resources. The supply chain eats itself. This is not an observation about ancient grain carts. It is a precise description of how operational costs compound over time and distance, a dynamic that has bankrupted empires from Rome to the British colonial system to the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Sun Tzu's prescription is unambiguous. Live off the enemy's land whenever possible. Use their grain, their horses, their supplies, not because it is cruel, but because it is the only way to prevent your own treasury from hemorrhaging. He calculates that a single unit of enemy resources captured in the field is worth vastly more than the equivalent shipped from home, because it eliminates the compounding cost of transportation. He is describing in the language of ancient China what a modern supply chain analyst would call cost optimization. He understood that the economy of the campaign was as important as the tactics of the battle, arguably more so because a well-supplied army with inferior tactics can outlast a brilliant army that runs out of food. Logistics in Sun Tzu's framework is not the boring administrative back end of warfare. It is the primary determinant of whether a state can sustain its ambitions at all. But the deepest layer of Sun Tzu's economic thinking is not about supply chains. It is about what he considers the highest form of strategy, and it has nothing to do with armies. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. This line is usually treated as a kind of Zen paradox: the warrior who transcends combat, the general who achieves victory through stillness. That reading is romantic and almost entirely wrong. Sun Tzu is making a financial argument.
Every battle, even a victory, costs something. Soldiers die, equipment is destroyed, horses are lost, commanders are wounded, supply stores are depleted. A kingdom that wins 100 battles still pays the price of 100 battles, and that price, accumulated over campaigns and decades, becomes the mechanism of its own collapse. The general who subdues the enemy without fighting has achieved the same strategic outcome at a fraction of the cost. He has preserved his army, his treasury, his supply stores, and his productive population. He has spent almost nothing and gained everything. This is not mysticism. This is the most aggressive form of cost-benefit analysis ever applied to geopolitics. Sun Tzu understood that the objective of statecraft is not victory in the moment. It is solvency over time. A kingdom that wins dramatically and expensively is weaker than a kingdom that wins quietly and cheaply. The spectacle of conquest is a liability disguised as a triumph. And the tools he recommends for achieving bloodless victory, diplomacy, intelligence, psychological pressure, strategic alliance, misdirection, are all, without exception, cheaper than armies. He is not recommending them because they are elegant. He is recommending them because they work at a lower cost. His treatment of intelligence makes this financial logic explicit. Sun Tzu dedicates an entire chapter to spies, 5 types of intelligence assets, each serving a different function. And the argument he makes for investing in intelligence is not about security or ethical surveillance or national pride. It is about return on investment. A ruler who refuses to spend modest sums on intelligence will spend catastrophic sums on misdirected armies. A general who marches without knowing the enemy's position, strength, and intentions will consume months of campaign resources chasing ghosts or walking into ambushes. The information that a skilled spy can provide in a week could save the treasury the cost of an entire season of campaigning. Sun Tzu writes that foreknowledge, accurate information about the enemy, cannot be obtained through prayers or superstition or abstract calculation. It can only be obtained from people who actually know, and those people must be found, cultivated, paid, and protected. He is describing intelligence as capital investment. The upfront cost of building a capable intelligence network is trivially small compared to the downside risk of operating without one. Generals who ignored this calculation paid for it, sometimes with their armies, sometimes with their kingdoms. Information in Sun Tzu's framework is not merely power, it is the cheapest form of power available. And misallocating information, failing to gather it, failing to interpret it, failing to act on it, is the most expensive mistake a ruler can make. Speed in the art of war receives the same economic treatment. Speed is the essence of war. Take advantage of the enemy's unpreparedness, travel by unexpected routes, strike him where he has taken no precautions. This is not an endorsement of recklessness. It is an endorsement of cost minimization. Every day an army spends in the field is a day of consumption without production. Soldiers eat, horses eat, equipment degrades, farmers are absent from their fields. Tax revenues decline as the productive population is diverted to military service. The treasury drains in a slow, relentless bleed that no single dramatic battle can reverse. Speed interrupts that bleed. A campaign that achieves its objective in weeks costs a fraction of one that achieves the same objective in months. Sun Tzu's obsession with swift, decisive action is not about aggression, it is about limiting the financial duration of the crisis. He understood something that modern governments rediscover in every prolonged conflict. There is no military budget large enough to sustain indefinite campaigning. Every war has a financial clock running from the moment the first soldier marches. The general who ignores that clock will eventually find that time, not the enemy, has defeated him. What makes Sun Tzu's analysis permanently relevant is that the kingdoms around him proved his thesis in real time. States that embraced prolonged siege warfare, pouring resources into years-long campaigns against fortified cities, routinely found themselves financially hollowed out, vulnerable to internal revolt, unable to respond to new threats because their treasuries were empty and their populations were exhausted. States that applied the logic Sun Tzu described, rapid campaigns, targeted strikes, diplomatic maneuvering, intelligence-driven decision-making, tended to preserve their economic base. They fought less, spent less, and paradoxically achieved more durable outcomes than the kingdoms who fought constantly. The Warring States period eventually resolved not through the triumph of the most aggressive kingdom, but through the success of the most administratively and economically disciplined one. The state of Qin, which ultimately unified China, spent generations reforming its internal economy, standardizing its systems, and building a military that was lethal precisely because it was efficient. Sun Tzu would not have been surprised. The modern resonance of his thinking is impossible to ignore. The United States in Vietnam spent over $1 trillion in today's money, lost nearly 60,000 soldiers, and ultimately achieved no durable strategic objective.
The Soviet Union repeated the pattern in Afghanistan, a decade of campaign expenditure that accelerated the fiscal collapse of a superpower already straining under its own military budget. Sun Tzu identified the mechanism behind both failures 25 centuries earlier. When the cost of the campaign exceeds the value of the objective, prolonging the campaign does not improve the outcome, it only deepens the damage. Meanwhile, the tools he championed have become the primary instruments of modern geopolitical competition. Sanctions are Sun Tzu. They impose costs on the enemy without deploying armies. Cyber warfare is Sun Tzu. It achieves strategic disruption at a fraction of the cost of conventional military operations. Proxy conflicts, where great powers fund smaller actors to fight their battles, are Sun Tzu. Maximum strategic effect, minimized direct financial exposure. The world's most powerful states are still operating inside the framework he described. They have simply updated the tools while preserving the underlying logic. Achieve your objectives at the lowest possible cost and never commit your full resources to a contest you can win with a fraction of them. But perhaps the most unsettling implication of Sun Tzu's financial genius is what it reveals about the nature of power itself. He believed, and history has consistently validated, that the strength of a state is not measured by the size of its army. It is measured by the resilience of its economy. An army without a functioning treasury is not an army. It is a mob with weapons and a timeline. States fail not because they are defeated on the battlefield. States fail because they drain the capital that keeps their institutions coherent, their populations loyal, and their systems functional. The battlefield defeat is often just the visible moment at which a longer, quieter financial collapse becomes impossible to ignore. Sun Tzu saw this clearly. He understood that the ruler who wins a glorious battle and then faces a bankrupt treasury has not won. He has merely delayed his kingdom's dissolution and made it more expensive. The greatest victory is the one that costs least. The greatest general is the one who never has to fight. And the greatest danger facing any state is not the enemy waiting beyond the border. It is the uncalculated bill accumulating inside the treasury. Strip away the centuries of mythology, and The Art of War is not a book about how to fight. It is a book about the conditions under which fighting is no longer necessary. It is a book about restraint, the most difficult discipline for any ruler, any general, any state to maintain when pride and fear are pushing toward conflict. Sun Tzu asks rulers to subordinate their instincts to their arithmetic, to count the cost before they commit, to understand that every campaign they choose to avoid is a campaign they cannot lose.
He was not a warrior philosopher. He was a steward, someone who understood that the purpose of power is not its exercise, but its preservation, that the state which endures is not the one that strikes hardest, but the one that spends wisest. And in a world where financial systems collapse, supply chains fracture, debt burdens accumulate, and the cost of projecting force compounds year after year, that lesson is not ancient history. It is this morning's news. History does not repeat, but it charges interest on the lessons you fail to learn. If this gave you a new way of seeing the world, subscribe to Atlas of Coin. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.